Hello, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thanks for joining me for this IPA talk. And today I'm fortunate to have with me John Gatta, who is CEO of the ECRA Group, also is a professor of data science at Northwestern University. John's also a good friend, and ECRA's been a longtime partner with IPA on a variety of things. One of those with your HYA or Hazard Young subsidiary, John, helping us with our annual salary study this year and the last couple of years. So greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, great. So glad to be here. I'm appreciative of having the opportunity to chat, and hopefully we can have a little fun right here and teach a few things to districts along the way that they can take back.
Well, data science and fun are not always two terms you can be put together, but I agree with you, especially looking at us getting back on track post COVID with school accountability and knowing schools have to navigate those waters now yet again, and thinking about that with regards to assessment and data reporting, all that, John. And I know, through your obviously your background, professorial experience and your own academic background, but also the work that you're then doing with ECRA. What I'm always interested in talking with you and getting your perspective on things, but why I wanted to make sure we jumped on and recorded this IPA talk is just some perspective that you're offering to school districts when it comes to communicating assessments and accountability, and how we make sure that we maybe talk about this in a way that gives a broader picture, a broader story to tell with what's going on in schools. So would you mind just kind of enlightening us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do so. And then, this conversation could take us in whatever direction you feel like your members, would have the most interest in. And so, it's no surprise to school districts, right? They're coming out of the pandemic. There's sort of a renaissance of interest in data, and communities are asking a lot of questions, and other accountability bodies are asking a lot of questions in terms of, so where are our kids and how well are they doing? Strategically communicating to your board and to your broader community is quickly becoming a skill that all school leaders have to have. And one of the things that ECRA has been very involved in is not only helping school districts and schools be more sophisticated in terms of how they use data and how they adopt evidence-based practices, but really focusing on the leadership implications and the communication implications of data. Because that's, if you can't communicate it well, it's not going to resonate. And in general, the great work that you're doing isn't going to come across. And so we want to make sure, as strong advocates of public education, that all that great work is being documented in a very scientific way, in an objective way, but it's also being communicated appropriately. And
no, go ahead.
Yeah. And so, one of the things I like to start off with when we have these conversations is, when you think about sort of public reporting of school performance data, especially in Illinois, right, your head immediately goes to the release of the state report card, sort of an annual event that everybody gets ready for. And a bunch of data is collected throughout the year, specifically performance on tests like IAR. And then we release the state report card data under this, idea that this is a perfect and true reflection of the great work the schools are doing. But if you take a step back at really sort of the motivation of the state report card and really what it's designed to do, right? It's part of a larger federal act, right, to make sure that we are looking at school performance nationally, and that states are looking school by school so that they have a way to identify struggling schools and allocate resources appropriately, but ultimately to help schools help students. I mean, that's really, at the end of the day, what the motivation is. I mean, a byproduct of that is accountability and community reporting, but it's really about, like, how can we in the best way possible understand what's working and what's not working, so we can channel resources to those that are more in need, and ultimately, again, help schools help students. And so one of the statistics I like to start with, though, is, the latest release of the 2022 report card, right? So I'm just talking generally speaking here, right? If you were to just look generally at the data, roughly about 30% of students meet standards in ELA, and roughly 25% meet standards in math, right? Roughly speaking. And that's about what it is in the 3.8 range. And it's close to that even when you add at the high school level. And so what that gets morphed into, though, is it gets morphed into these statements, these sort of unproductive statements that, wow, only a quarter of our kids are at grade level in math, or only a third of our kids are at grade level in ELA, because that's how it sort of gets communicated, right? That oh, if they're not meeting standards, then that must be true. But if you were to
Well, and you got to understand too, John, we got value judgments that are being placed on those data to give us those types of results anyway, right?
Right. Exactly. And so, and that's part of the difficulty in communicating state report card data, is because there's a layer of state policy and federal policy that's sort of put on top of the results, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have this confounded nature between how can we look at performance more objectively separate from sort of federal and state policy that we've layered on top, right? And that's where it gets difficult. But one of the ways
layering would be the cut scores that are
right. Exactly.
Assessments. Correct.
Exactly. So, the way that at least part of the accountability system works is, students take tests like IIR, they respond to questions and they get a scale score, right? Every student gets a score, right? But then from there, the state policy sort of takes over, and then committees get together and they draw lines in the sand of what it means to be proficient, right? Or to meet standards or exceed standards or approach standards and so on and so forth. But it is more of a qualitative process. It's more of a process, geared towards identifying schools and accountability. One of the things that I encourage schools to do, and I motivate this point by taking a step back and saying, it's one thing to just say 30% of our students are meeting standards in ELA and 25%, are meeting standards in math. But it's another thing to say, and that's Illinois statistics. It's another thing to say, well, what other data do we have available to contextualize that to some degree, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because it doesn't seem right just on its surface that could be the case, right? Well, if you look at the latest NAEP data, right, this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress the federal government does in grades 4 and 8, right? So they recently released data as well. Well, if you look at sort of the performance of Illinois relative to the nation, right, you see a huge disconnect, because if you were to just pull, and I'm just pulling something here that would be close to the numbers that I described, because NAEP is only grades 4 and grade 8. If you were to pull grade 8 reading average scale scores at the nation, you'll find that Illinois is about the 86th national percentile. Mm-hmm. At a state. So here you have it where, roughly 25 to 30% of our students are at grade level according to the state report card, but we're like in the 86th national percentile in terms of our competitiveness to other states in the nation. So there's a disconnect.
Yeah, right. Just the exact language I was going to use, by the way. Yeah.
And so that plays out at a local school and a local district level as well, because the same thing exists. So if you were to take, let's say, a particular school, I'm going to look up just some numbers as we're talking here, so I don't quote them incorrectly here. But if you were to look at, let's say, math proficiency, right, for 2022, and let's say your school is at 47%. Right. So your school just took the IR, you got your results back, and 47% of your students met or exceeded grade level standards in math. And now that will be, whether you like it or not, sort of generalized and communicated it as less than half of your students are at grade level in math. Right? But if you were to contextualize that a little bit, if you were to layer on another metric, right, in the form of a percentile, what you find is that if your school has 47% of students meeting standards in math, you are in the top 10% of the state. You are at the 91st percentile. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what that does, again, is it adds context. As a statistician, as a data scientist, as someone that has studied the behavior of metrics and data my entire career, I've come to sort of this adage that a number should never live alone. You should never just report a number and let it hang out there by itself, right? Yeah. You have to put another number alongside it to add some context, right? Some broader understanding of what that is. So if you, as a matter of reporting to your board or community, just report out that 47% of your students are meeting or exceeding state level standards in math, people are going to interpret that all kinds of ways, right? But if you put that alongside the other number but that puts us in the 91st percentile across the state, all of a sudden that conversation changes, right? The headline, moves from latest test results show that less than 0.5% of the school or district's students are at grade level to this particular school or district's in the top 10% of the state. Mm-hmm. Same numbers, same performance, completely different headline and something that has a completely different context to it.
Let me ask you this, John, because this is where just to be a devil's advocate and where the critics may come in. Again, those that are continuing to criticize performance based on this, the value judgment that we place at the cut scores that are giving us these percentages of kids meeting and exceeding standards. But what happens with the critic that says, well, 91st percentile, but all the kids are performing poorly according to where the proficiency stands. So what does that really tell us? I mean, except where you were to then lay it out in comparison to like the NAEP data that shows us in the 85th percentile across the country. But I still feel like we got to figure out how to get to the issue of the proficiency score as well, right? At some point in time.
Sure, absolutely, right. I mean, there is this idea of proficiency, but I personally am an advocate of you have to set those benchmarks in part more empirically, more normative. You do have to take into account what we know actually exists across the nation and across the state. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, a lot of the ways that some of these cut scores are developed is, it's done more qualitatively. I mean, it's basically you put people in a room and you ask them to make a judgment about, what items an average kid would get right, what average kids would get wrong, and you work through this process and you end up at these at these standards that, in my opinion, they have meaning. I'm not saying that they have meaning. They have a certain definition to them, but what they promote is a misinterpretation of what it really means to necessarily be at grade level. And so one of the examples I give all the time, some of the your members that have heard me speak before have probably heard me give this example, but I think it's a good motivating example. If you're a parent, you have a son or daughter, you just had a baby, right? And maybe he's born at 8 pounds, and then you go back to your visit. Now he's at 10 pounds, at 12 pounds, at 14 pounds, at 18 pounds, right? Well, if that's the only information that you got as a parent, would you be very satisfied with that?
Yeah, you wouldn't know what that means, right?
Because you don't know what it means.
Yeah.
If we don't know what a quantity like height and weight means by itself, how are we going to understand what more abstract metrics, right, like scale scores on a test mean? And so the first question you ask when you're a parent, when you're in that room with the pediatrician, when they put your kid's weight chart, the first thing, what do you ask? Is that normal? Right? What percentile are they at? And the minute that you start realizing that, oh, well, my son or daughter's tracking very normally, just like all the other kids across the nation and across the globe, and then it seems like he's developing just like they should, right? And so, but to get back to your point of, I think there's a couple things we can do to combat that. One is to look at Illinois' relative position to the nation, right? And that's sort of a statistic that I gave as a way to do that, is to superimpose state level results on more national statistics that are available, like NAEP. And what you realize is Illinois is actually pretty competitive nationally. And so
always have been.
You can't just
You don't look at just NAEP, you look at ACT and other.
Right, all those, right. I'm just pulling NAEP as an example.
Right, that's right.
I could pull any other. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when we were delivering the ACT statewide, and I'm not advocating we go back to that, I'm just using that as an example, because we're very satisfied with what the SAT is now. But as a state that was giving that test statewide, we always ranked right at the top when it came to overall performance on that test.
Right.
I don't have SAT as an example because I've not looked at the comparative data. I just remember when we were doing Vision 2020, which you were a part of years ago, we were looking at ACT data just to put kind of this line in the sand that Illinois schools, for all the issues that we have, our kids do pretty well. We have a lot to be proud of.
Absolutely. And you would find a similar story if you pulled other like NWA MAP or other nationally normed assessment. You're going to find out that Illinois students are actually pretty competitive, right? Mm-hmm. So that's important because it does start to diffuse at least that initial piece of, well, if we just compare ourselves to each other, then that doesn't really matter because none of us are doing very well. Well, that's not true. We're very competitive. And of course, you could keep extending that and saying, well, it still doesn't matter. Even though Illinois is competitive nationally, it still doesn't matter because our nation's doing terribly, right? And then you could say, well, okay, how do we take PISA, other kinds of global, assessments, and say, where do we rank? And then ultimately, maybe we could go to sort of, norming at the galaxy level, and the integral
Right.
norm against the solar system and other galaxies, and eventually we'll get there, right? But I think what you find, as you go through that exercise of looking at things relative and normative at larger and larger levels, is you realize what Einstein proved about time and space, a long time ago, is that everything's relative, right? Yeah. And if time and space is relative, information and performance is relative too. It's really difficult to draw lines in the sand and establish sort of an absolute standard for what it means to be proficient, right? Without taking into account what we know exists across the district, across the state, across the nation, and across the globe. And when you do that, you find out that we're actually pretty competitive. And so that, alongside numbers like proficiency, just gives more context, right? It gives you a better shot of telling your story and doing it in a way that is going to be closer to or a better reflection of the great work that you're doing.
Well, so I think the lesson here is, anytime we're looking at these numbers is, take that number for what it is, but then also making sure to put it in and, give it the nuance that it requires, and the context that it requires here, to make sure that we're giving a complete picture and can tell the whole story about what our kids are really doing. I think that's important, John, just from the perspective of the story our kids are telling about themselves.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, we want to think that there's this maybe a bit of a disconnect, between what the kids know or think they know about what's going on and what adults are talking about with regards to them. We got to know that those conversations happening at the board meetings or in the district office or whatever, that eventually is trickling back to them too. And so, I think it's a fair representation for them to have kind of a sense of where they are, where they exist in the galaxy. I was hoping you'd get a Star Wars, theme in there somewhere, John. And you started quoting Einstein. I thought, well, geez, we're going to get E equals MC squared at some point in time. So we're covering a lot of the bases. But I think that's really critical with regards. Because that's basically bringing this back around, kind of right full circle. It's the kind of story that's we're telling about ourselves in our schools, but more importantly, kind of story we're giving kids to tell about who they are and the work that they're doing.
Right. And from through the lens of data science, right, it's this broader idea of using benchmarks to help understand metrics and communicate metrics, right? And so, benchmark is just sort of a loose term to just like, it goes back to my sort of mantra, like I said in the beginning part of this this conversation, of a number should never live alone. It's got to live alongside a number that has some meaning to it. The whole scientific method is predicated on this idea of what did we observe against what did we expect to observe under a set of conditions or assumptions, right? The whole scientific method is predicated on at least two numbers: what you observed against what you expected to observe, right? And that expectation is linked to some definition or a set of assumptions or some conditions, right, that produce the number. And so when we talk about sort of reporting and data science and sort of the use of data in organizations, sometimes we refer to that as a benchmark. But a benchmark could be a baseline value. It could be just, where was your number at some point in the past, so that you have a reference point. Because if you've really moved the needle in your district, right, maybe just putting your number alongside what the number was 5 years ago adds that context, right, to you to tell the story. So a benchmark can be a baseline, right? A benchmark can also be a normative reference, like I use here today. A benchmark can just be a reference to a state percentile, a national percentile, right? Something that gives an external comparison to the number that you're reporting. So that you can add context, so that you don't say only 47% of our students are meeting standards, but you add context to say, but that's in the top 10% of the state. So you got to take that, for what it's worth. Or a benchmark can come in the form of sort of a target or sort of a local policy kind of value. So one of the examples I give with that is, class size is something, or student pupil ratios are one of those difficult metrics, right? Because it's one of those where, well, we don't want it too high, right? Because then it's going to start to degrade the educational experience, right? But we also don't want it too low because that's going to end up being cost prohibitive, right? If we
Yep.
have one teacher for every student, right?
Right.
So, but we can't have 100, 100 students for every teacher either, right? So the optimal balance is going to be some, what I call some strategic zone that balances sort of cost and educational, relevance there. But again, you can use that as an idea of a benchmark. Let's say, I'm just throwing numbers out there. Let's say that your number, as a school district is that you're at 22. Right, maybe, right.
Mm-hmm.
But you could just report out that our average class size is 22, right? Or you could report out our average class size is 22, and this is within the strategic zone set by the Board of Education as striking the right balance between cost and educational impact.
What I like about what you're talking about there is that the district taking real ownership in kind of how they're going to be handling the results, basically,
Yes.
of these assessments, and then what they're going to choose to do with the data that they've received. You're talking about the type of investments that are going to be made into the instructional process for these kids, and what they need to see to make the decisions with regards to that. Let me pivot us just a little bit, John. And when you and I were talking about this at the III conference up in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, which predicated us jumping on here for this recording, and one of the things that I brought up in our conversation was just, the overall reason we give the tests every spring, the IAR, and then of course the SAT test. And the SAT is in a bit of a different place, in at least in my mindset, just because it does have the additional benefit of being a college entrance exam. And so I think there's some value that goes along with that. And so it can be treated just a little bit differently in terms of what's required for students when it comes to taking that test. But when you look at IAR in particular, it and I've been someone that's evolved with this over time, because I've been sitting in this seat since we were having discussions like about PARC or Smarter Balance, and which those two paths we're going to take, and what do we have for hopes out of those types of assessment systems. And the thought back then is that we could create assessment systems that could kind of be the be all end all for us, which was, one, take care of the federal accountability requirements, and then two, be a test that we could actually use for instructional purposes. And if what would be even better is we not only have a summative test that we could give, but then we'd also have formative tests that could be given so that schools could track student performance and proficiency over time, even within the course of the school year. I would say, though, that our hopes and dreams, or the thoughts related to that, and I'll take ownership of it, maybe the hopes and dreams I had for those things just have not come to fruition. And there are a variety of reasons, I would say, for that: changes of personnel, people, and political motivations, and everything in between. So it's cause for me to step back and really reflect on, have we ever really defined or determined, maybe definition isn't the right way to look at it, but determined what the ultimate purpose for giving these assessments is, particularly at the K-8 level? Well, I think at the bare minimum, at the baseline, is for federal accountability purposes. And so the question I always keep coming back to is the desire for us to utilize that assessment not only for federal accountability purposes, but also for instructional purposes. Is that just asking too much for these tests, especially when we're wanting to try to shorten the length of time and the overall burden with regards to that assessment to the absolute bare minimum? Because in my conversations with you, I'm not sure that can be done. If you desire instructional information from these tests, but you want to keep the test short, that might be a difficult thing to do, when you consider what you have to have from the test in order to produce those kinds of results. And so, so I'm just speaking what I believe that I kind of heard from you during our conversation. But what I'm kind of curious about, with your experience, in the work that you're doing with ECRA, and as a data scientist, what's your general thought here with regards to just the assessment broadly. Not that necessarily I'm asking you to make a value judgment
Sure.
on what the test should
Yeah,
be,
absolutely.
but just
Right.
what the difficulty is in maybe asking too much for that assessment.
Right. Well, I think, I think the nuance here is, it comes back to the basic idea of assessment design in terms of, every assessment instrument is built, right, to optimize, one or two objectives of what it's trying to accomplish, right? And fortunately, unfortunately, right, I'm not trying to make a value, judgment here, but I think the objectives are divergent. And so that the consequence of that is it makes it very difficult to do an assessment that's going to accomplish everything. I'll give you more color to that and specifically kind of, what I mean by that is, the state testing program plays a very important role from a federal accountability standpoint and from a ways to identify school and allocate federal resources to struggling schools, right? But the federal accountability piece of it is really directed at the building, right? It's where we're identifying buildings, right? We're reporting on building and subgroups and things. But at the end of the day, is we're trying to build, if we were only looking, right, through the lens of federal and state accountability and the idea and the opportunity to identify struggling schools and to channel resources, effectively, to achieve that objective, right, we do not need the length of testing that we need to achieve another objective that educators always speak to, and that it has to be relevant for classroom instruction, and it has to, we need to be able to report out at the kid level, at the standard level, right? All this granular diagnostic reporting, right? Not only diagnostic reporting by standard, but by reporting like by kid by standard, right?
Right.
Well, the more your objective, right? I'm using the objectives here in the term of the more that's an objective of the process that ultimately a state testing program has to accomplish that, right? Well, then you're pulling it in a direction of considerable increase in testing time, because if you need reliability at the kid by standard level, let's say, right, the single most effective way to make a test more reliable is to make it longer.
Right.
And there's other things you can do, and there's other psychometric pieces and stuff. But at the end of the day, if you want a valid and reliable test that's reportable at the kid level, going all the way down to the standard, you're going to have a really, really long test, right? Mm-hmm. And it might not be necessary, though, if you're looking at it through the lens of just federal and state accountability, right? Because to have a valid and reliable test to report at the building and subgroup level for the purpose of identifying struggling schools and allocating resources, you could get that done with probably a 30-minute math test and a 30-minute ELA test. Now, you will forfeit the ability to be sort of like reporting granular by kid and by parent and all these, but is that really what's needed?
Yeah.
Out of a federal and state accountability measure? Or are we better off just looking at it through the lens of, let's just build a test that meets the specifications of federal and state accountability and identifying schools and allocating resources, but not try to make it something that's useful in the classroom? Because the reality is schools have other tests and other things that they're doing locally that are serving that purpose. I mean, my speculation is even if that were to be a reality, it still wouldn't work.
You mean as far as when you say be a reality, you mean having an assessment that actually could handle providing instructional information or how
Correct.
Instructional decisions should be thought of?
Right. Because I believe, and again, this is just kind of my own beliefs and speculation, is that any assessment that is part of a federal state accountability system that has large dollar allocations, right, and sanctions associated with it, right, yeah, you're never going to get around a slower, more disciplined process of reporting results. I just don't.
Well, it's because these stakes are so high, right? I mean, it's part of the reason. Part of the reason that it takes so long to report that data is, I mean, not only because of the length of the test, but it's because we are looking to dot every I and cross every T to make sure very accurate, because of the political and public consequences that come as a result if it's not right.
That's right. So even, let's say, in this utopian world that from a testing instrument standpoint, you could strike the right balance, mm-hmm, right? Let's just sort of stipulate to that for the sake of this conversation. From a process standpoint, I still don't see how that gets done, because the requirements to dot the I's and cross the T's, you're still going to be getting your spring results back in the fall.
Yeah.
And
so the hopes of being able to see results get turned around like NWA is able to with the MAP test, that's just not a reality.
I don't believe it's a reality, given how much has to be done to make sure that things are right. Like you brought up NWEA. What's great about that? Well, the minute a student takes a test, they get their score the minute they're done.
Right.
And then teachers get their scores the next day.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of argument, let's say NWEA was the state assessment program.
That would change.
Even though the assessment is capable of giving that result back immediately in the next day, I don't see a situation in which you're going to get those results back the next day. And so even if NWEA MAP was the state assessment program, I surmise that you're going to probably be taking that test twice, once for the state assessment program and once for your local assessment program, because you want the results for them. And that's not a value judgment, because I believe that is proper. It's the way to take your time to do it. For such a high stakes environment, you have to make sure you go through correction periods, and you have to make sure that you go through other QA processes to ensure that everything's accurate.
You know, you just saying it though, having to take the test twice, I think that the rational person would say, why take it twice if I don't have to? My point to that is if you already have something like NWA that's giving you that formative data, and then can take for accountability purposes another assessment that can be shorter, why not just do that? I don't know.
Right.
I mean, I'm not going to put you on the spot for a position on that, John, but I think rhetorically, it's worth for us, all of us, considering, I would say, because it would, the time and money that something like that would save just in and of itself, and still get us really the result that we're getting right now. The result that we're getting right now from an accountability perspective. You know, if you're looking for as you talked about, identifying those schools, you know, in terms of those that need support. I talked to certain school leaders that are like, I find real value in seeing where we land in terms of accountability and what our designation is, because I can use that as something to celebrate or a motivator to improve performance, all of that. But we don't necessarily need this long test in order to get us.
No, you don't. No, you don't. And I think if you take a step back and you think about, you know, what's the way to strike the best balance and make sure that the right information is used in the right context. Yeah, I think you start to at least to consider maybe the formal accountability test should be shrinking, not growing.
Mm-hmm.
But not to the point that it's not meeting its objectives, but that it's laser focused on its objectives of federal state accountability to identify schools, right, and to channel resources appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
But stay there. Don't let it drift into a broader set of considerations that are just gonna make it much more complicated, much more longer, you know, much more expensive, and ultimately probably still won't satisfy educators.
Right. Agreed.
But I don't want to send the message that it is important. I am somebody that firmly believes that assessment is a fundamental component of an educational system.
Sure.
You have to have it, and you have to have a degree of standardized assessment that exists at the federal level, the state level, at the district level, because it is really important for visibility in the performance.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. Well, especially when we're talking about the use of public dollars, right?
Right.
And we have to make sure to include that part of it. Well,
and that's
John,
why I don't think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, please finish your thought.
That's what I was going to say, because one other kind of things that I've heard over the years too is like, right, we're all taking tests. Can't we just kind of send our data into the state and have that be the accountability? There's so much money at stake. The stakes are so high that I just don't see that ever being a reality where you don't have a degree of standardization, right? Yeah. Where you don't have a common definition applied across the state as to how you identify schools and how you channel resources.
Well, and while at its face, something like that may be attractive. I think for us, you know, for those serving in public schools in particular, they do have to understand the inherent risk that comes with something like that. I mean, you open yourself up to a lot higher level of criticism. Some of that criticism may be fair, depending on, you know, because then you as a school have to make sure that you have high quality assessments that you're using. And, you have to be able to defend the reliability, validity of those things, and make sure that they're actually, measuring up to some standard that we
Right.
have. That's agreed
Exactly.
upon, right? For all of us for that. So, John, I always appreciate the opportunity to chat. I'm glad we could do this in a recording. I always feel like I get now a greater sense of what it's like to be a student in one of your classes at Northwestern. I'm sure talking about
No,
this.
I enjoy it. I enjoy it. So anytime I'm happy to help. And if there's anything I can do or ECRA can do to help your members along the way, I'm happy to do it.
Well, appreciate that. We'll for sure put ECRA's website and all of that in the show notes. But just so that we get it out there, where can people learn more about ECRA and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think so. ECRAgroup.com obviously is the first place to start. We do have a dedicated Illinois page, ECRAgroup.com/IL, which has some specific Illinois resources. We are also a Illinois learning partner too. So, schools that are out there that might be watching about not only how can ECRA help, but we are an approved learning partner too. So we can, if you are designated schools that need to engage a partner, we could be an option for you as well.
Perfect. Appreciate that. Well, Dr. John Gatta, thanks for spending a little time talking about assessment and everything we need to be considering about it in our schools.
All right, great.
Yeah, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. As always, if there's anything we can do, don't hesitate to give us a call, or you can check us out on the web at www.ilprincipals.org. Take care.